Shane van Gisbergen and Richie Stanaway have won the 2023 Great Race in Supercars, taking a dominant victory over the competition. And while it's fair to say it wasn't the best Bathurst by its very high standards, there is still plenty to talk about here in my usual round review, now complete with a face cam and a poorly implemented green screen, which I will improve over the coming videos. Let's jump into it. We'll kick off with the usual race recap, jumping straight into how the main event unfolded, and it was a very clean start overall, a stark contrast to 2022 and the absolute chaos we saw on lap 1 and indeed the restart shortly after. But Jamie Whincup got a big jump over David Russell on the start line, a far better reaction time, and James Golding, the Newlon car, also had a fair bit of pace in those opening laps. It didn't take long, sadly, for us to get our first casualty of the race, with Craig Lowndes suffering a gear tower failure in his wildcard entry, and that pretty much put him out of contention. Simona Di Silvestre and Team Fiore were one of the many that had a clumsy little clash down at the chase, but the first safety car actually came from Kevin Estre, one of the really hot topics coming into the Great Race. Unfortunately, he did make a mistake, putting it in the wall at turn 1, not doing too much damage, but he did get bogged, bringing out the first safety car. On the restart, Pye and Wood came together at Murray's Corner, which resulted in that R&J Batteries car getting stuck in the wall, and then it was a largely clean restart, although it all kicked off again around lap 70. We had an engine failure for Wood once again in that number 8 car, which definitely put them out of the race this time. Meanwhile, at the top of the mountain, James Moffat made a pretty rare mistake and put the monster car in the wall at the dipper, doing significant damage and absolutely taking those guys out of the race, just continuing the bad luck that that car seems to have around Bathurst. On the restart, Simona Di Silvestre had an incredible save on the grass going into turn 2. Griffin's Bend kept it out of the wall very impressively, and then later on, as further safety cars came out, 97 Pit taking advantage of one of those caution periods. Brody Kostecki in the 99 did not, and that would be a big factor in the strategy department, because by the time the final stages of the race were approaching, it was a 2-horse race between the 2 Red Bull drivers. That all changed on lap 136 though, when Brock Feeney was tragically taken out of the competition despite his strong pace with yet another gear tower failure. That put him in the garage. They got the car back out there, but he was obviously far behind the competition at that point, and there was no late race safety car to really close the pack up, and that meant that Shane van Gisbergen, out in front despite a few reliability scares in his department, was largely able to cruise to the victory. So that means that our podium is of course Shane van Gisbergen and Richie Stanaway taking the win, Stanaway adding a very strong feather to his cap, winning Bathurst so early in his Supercars return. Brody Kostecki and David Russell in second place. That car looked super fast in qualifying, but just didn't quite have the legs in the race itself. And then Anton Di Pasquale and Tony D'Alberto doing a great job for Shell V Power Racing in third. So how did all that stack up against my pre-round predictions? Well, it's the usual story here, not good. I predicted that neither Red Bull or Erebus would win the Great Race, but that of course did happen. We had Shane van Gisbergen on top, and indeed the Erebus car in second as well, so I was far from accurate on that prediction. My second prediction was probably the closest one to coming true, and that's that we would see a brake change issue that would take a leading car out of contention. Now, Shane van Gisbergen was very unhappy with the feel of his brake pedal late in that race after a change, but it did come good, and I thought that prediction may have actually come true, but it resolved itself in the end. And my final prediction, I'm glad didn't happen because I don't like seeing cars totally wrecked, but I did predict the Gen 3 rollover purely because these cars were a lot looser. I was expecting a lot more dramas actually going through the kink at the chase, which is what led to this prediction, but overall, pretty clean down that part of the racetrack. Now let's get to Clash Chat, the part of the show where I normally take the most controversial moment on the track and discuss it in a bit more detail, exploring the ins and outs of the rules. But there wasn't all that much that happened in terms of controversy on the racetrack itself this weekend, so I'm going to do something dangerous, and I'm going to talk about the controversy off the track, because we obviously had a huge parity row that was brewing up to Bathurst and indeed pretty much exploded by the time the teams got there. Now this all sort of kicked off. Obviously Ford throughout the year have claimed to be at a disadvantage, and even as a GM fan, when you look at the results, the paper suggests that is indeed the case to some sort of extent. And after Sandown, they were very concerned that they would be very uncompetitive at Bathurst. Now, reports are varying depending on what outlet you go to, but it sounds like Ford have actually got to see some more data between the two cars in the lead up to Bathurst, and they believe they identified a issue in terms of parity and that they were indeed at a disadvantage based on that information, and B, that they could actually present a fix for that as well. And they presented this to the Supercars Commission and requested the upgrades in time for the Great Race. Now, where all this gets messy is the parity trigger, the rules that the teams are governed by, and Supercars itself, that says they cannot implement a parity adjustment unless the parity trigger has been reached, and that has to be triggered over the course of 5 races, I assume, so they've got enough data on the actual racetrack to kind of compare how the cars are performing. Now, Sandown was the 4th race in that sequence, Bathurst would have been the 5th, and because they hadn't reached that 5th race, they were just one short, that meant that any changes to the Ford would have had to be approved by Chev, and being the Great Race, the big one that they all want to win, of course, Chev did not back that change. Now, it's interesting to see that Barry Ryan has actually come out saying that he supported the upgrades for the Ford because he believes, based on the data he saw, there was a problem, and indeed Ford were presenting a reasonable fix. So it all got very controversial. Fortunately, there was no boycott or anything like that, which would have been disastrous for Supercars and indeed the fans at the track and watching all around the world like us. But yeah, it is really frustrating when there is validated data to suggest there's a problem that can seemingly easily be fixed, but just because of the ins and outs of the rules, it couldn't be actioned. That is frustrating for me personally. I definitely get why the parity trigger is there and that you do want to collect data over multiple racetracks before making a decision, but at the same time, if the data is right in front of you and there's clearly a problem, in my opinion, the rule should allow Supercars to step in at that point and make the change. And as of recording today, Supercars have actually announced that that parity trigger was reached during the Bathurst 1000, and as such, they are reviewing the cars again, and there will almost certainly be some upgrades on that Mustang before the next event at Surfers Paradise. Let's cheer things up with the weekend wins. These are the things that I left Bathurst feeling pretty positive about, or surprised in a positive way, and the first thing was the Gen 3 reliability, which, while not perfect, far from it, it was a lot better than I think a lot of us were expecting, considering how much practice happens at Bathurst, the brutality of the track, and of course the length of the race on Sunday. We saw a few issues. We obviously saw a big engine failure for Andre Heimgartner's car. We saw some steering issues even for the 2 leaders, which made things interesting at the end. And of course, just a little few niggle issues around rubber as well building up. But overall, considering the reports and the concerns leading up to this event, the Gen 3 cars held up a lot better than I expected in terms of terminal breakdowns. The second key positive for me was that we didn't really see any major issues during the brake changes. This was a huge point of concern leading in to the point where the teams in Sandown refused to change the brakes basically because it wasn't compulsory. But at Bathurst it was, and by and large there weren't many issues. I was strongly expecting to see a leading car, or certainly cars in the top half of the field, pretty much taken out of contention because of air in the system or something like that. It didn't really happen, or at least it wasn't widely picked up on the reporting, so that seemed to be a positive surprise as well. My other key positive is that the first half of the race, I felt we had some really good racing, some good wheel-to-wheel racing, and the cars clearly could follow so much better under the Gen 3 regulations. I was at Bathurst in 2022, I was sitting down at the chase, and you could visibly see the effect of dirty air going through the kink at the chase last year, but this year, mindful that I was watching on TV, they seem to follow so much better through that section of the track, and indeed over the top as well. So again, a big box check there for Gen 3. And then my final key plus is that Shane van Gisbergen seemed to be quite humbled and grateful in his victory. Shane this year for me, even as, and this is dangerous, but I am a Shane Van Gisbergen fan in terms of the way he drives. But even I, as a fan, have been a little bit frustrated and disappointed at how down he's being so publicly this year at certain points. And I was hoping that his final season in Supercars, at least for the foreseeable future, wouldn't end on a sour note. And it has felt like it was heading in that direction at a few points this year. But at Bathurst, he seemed to show, or at least gave a hint of some of his emotions and sort of gratitude towards the series, and indeed winning Bathurst for a third time. So for me, that was a key positive. It felt like the waters are calm. Any sort of political stuff was put aside for that moment, which was good to see, because you do want to see a happy winner on the top step. And what about my weekend woes, the things that didn't work out so well? Well, the second half of the race was really, really dull. The cars were so spread out. We were just waiting for a safety car that normally comes 9 times out of 10 at Bathurst, but the second half of the race was incredibly clean, and I'm not out there shouting or crying out for an accident, but I do like the bunching of the field that comes with a safety car. But it just didn't happen. Everyone was pretty spaced out. There wasn't too much wheel-to-wheel action. Kind of felt like a lot of drivers were going around to a number on their dash. And that leads me to my second weekend woe and a question. Is the soft tyre the right choice for Bathurst? Now, if you haven't followed the storyline, Supercars always used to bring the hard tyre to Bathurst. This year, they brought the soft. And I feel, while not the only culprit, I do feel like it may have played a big role in why the back half of the race was so dull, and that we didn't see a late race safety car either. Now, my logic behind this is that with the hard tyre, that thing pretty much held up just about the whole stint at Bathurst without too much drop off. And as a result, the drivers were able to push hard just about every single lap with a little bit of conservation factored in. With the soft tyre, however, they had to be very conservative to try and get that tyre to the end of each stint. And I feel like in the back half of the race, that meant that a lot of drivers were lapping to a number. They weren't pushing as hard through the high-speed corners over the top of the hill, therefore not getting close to the barriers, therefore reducing the chance of a safety car. And I do wonder why Supercars felt the need to bring the soft tyre as well. I am curious to know, maybe they were worried about the Gen 3 and Gen 2 lap times being compared. Gen 3 understandably a little bit slower due to the reduced downforce, and maybe they brought the soft tyre to try and compensate for that lap time. Alright, let's get into some of my awards. Just a fun, light-hearted way to reflect on the weekend. Now, surprise of the weekend was actually a bit hard to pin down, but the name that keeps coming to mind is James Golding. They didn't have the best race on Sunday, but his lap in qualifying to get in the top 10 shootout was fantastic, and his lap in the top 10 shootout was even better. I was incredibly impressed with how he performed with all that pressure, and it's good to see that Newlawn team back towards the front as well. The V7 award, who dropped the cylinder? Well, it's got to go to Brad Jones Racing. These guys just have the worst luck around Bathurst, and that certainly continued in 2023. Obviously, the number 8 car was in the wall and then had their engine fire. The Middies car seemed to be involved in countless incidents that were subject to investigations. And then the SCT car and the Pizza Hut car teammates came together as well. So it was just a disaster all around for that team. Although I think the Middies car did actually finish in the top 10, which was a pretty solid recovery. Who gave it the Jandal? Who's getting that award for absolutely sending it? Well, I've got to give it to Brody Kostecki and his lap in the top 10 shootout. It was just hooked up. That car looked so alive. You could just sense the speed in that thing, and it was really cool to watch going over the top of the mountain, down Skyline. The thing was just amazing. I really enjoyed watching that lap. And my special shout out, it's got to go to the Conrod Straight doggo. If you didn't see it, there was this dog pretty much chasing the cars in practice, running parallel to Conrod Straight. It's very funny, very cute. I will leave a link to that video down in the description. In terms of my overall weekend rating, I've got to admit, when the checkered flag fell at Bathurst, I was pretty disappointed. Now, my hype levels were pretty high. They normally are for Bathurst, and even more so this year with Gen 3 and all the unpredictability around it. But the race itself, as I said, the second half was really, really dull. There just wasn't much happening. And the things that did make it more interesting were reliability question marks, which isn't normally how you like to see races resolved anyway. So for me, I'm going to give this one 3 stars. The first half was pretty solid, but again, that back half just needed something to spring some life into it. But for you guys, I had 102 people vote their thoughts as well on the race. We had 11% go for 5 stars, but the majority of people, 34 and 32%, were split between 4 and 3 stars. As always, I like to finish up with some thoughts and discussion points from you guys. So a big thank you to everyone who left the comments and an idea and a discussion point. There's just so many, I couldn't get to all of them, and these videos normally go on long enough. But the first one here is from Josh Breen, who says he would have rated it 5 stars if there was a late race battle with Feeney. So gutting that they had a mechanical failure. And yeah, I probably, even if there was a late race battle between Feeney and Giz, probably still wouldn't have been in the 5-star territory for me, because there just was that big lull in that halfway to 3/4 point of the race. But yeah, we were robbed because that was brewing really, really nicely. Feeney had a lot of pace. By the time they did their final pit stops, he should have been more or less in the 2-second window to Shane van Gisbergen. So we could have seen a battle, and it would have been juicy too, because Shane van Gisbergen is leaving Supercars at the end of the year, so he's got no one to keep happy. And Brock Feeney, he's a young charger. Jamie Whincup, the team boss, is his teammate. So yeah, it would have been really juicy to see how all that unfolded. But sadly, even more so for Brock Feeney, we didn't get to see that battle. The second one here from NASCAR National, I was curious to see how many people from overseas would tune into this year's great race. And he says, it was nice seeing SVG win as someone that primarily watches NASCAR, but yeah, it should have been a much better race than what it was. At least the attrition showed new viewers like myself how tough Mount Panorama is on equipment. And yeah, it's probably the key thought I actually had when this race was wrapping up was, this was not an ordinary Bathurst, and I feel like it's probably done itself a disservice for anyone that was tuning in on the back of Shane van Gisbergen's success in NASCAR, because this was a strangely tame edition of the Bathurst 1000, and we just haven't seen dominance like that in a very long time. So yeah, it was a solid race. It was good that Shane van Gisbergen was able to win, because I'm sure that plenty of people that have found out about him through NASCAR have tuned in at some points this season going, why isn't he performing over there? So it was great he was able to show what he can do, even though he doesn't fully get along with these Gen 3 cars. And indeed, on the mechanical front, as I've already said, the cars held up better than I expected, but Mount Panorama, of course, is incredibly tough when you consider the punishment that any car goes through around that circuit. And the last one here from Max Jones touches on a few different points, but there's one I really want to pull out, and that's that drive-through penalty for David Reynolds, which was a very harsh penalty for the crime. Now, he absolutely did the wrong thing. That car overtook under safety car, shouldn't have happened, but it should have been solved in a far better way. For me, like for a lot of you out there, it would seem a full-blown drive-through penalty was way, way, way too severe for the crime that was committed, and that could have been solved through a 5-second time penalty at a pit stop or the redress, even though apparently they didn't want to do that. For me, yeah, going straight to the drive-through penalty, there needs to be some sort of other option there for little mistakes like that, because it took an exciting and fast car out of contention, and while of course mistakes and rule breaking has to be punished, that just seemed way, way too severe. Alright, as tame as Bathurst was, let's not forget that we do have a championship battle brewing, and it is continuing to brew nicely. Now, sadly, after Bathurst and the DNF for Brock Feeney, he has largely been taken out of contention. While not impossible to come back, it is looking like it's now a 2-horse race between Brody Kostecki and Shane van Gisbergen. We've got 2 rounds left, 4 races, both on brutal street circuits, so it could be a thrilling end to the championship, even if Bathurst wasn't the most exciting event. And then on the team's front, Erebus do continue to lead the way over Red Bull Ampol Race, and that championship should also come down quite close. Brad Jones Racing, despite their disaster at Bathurst, are still doing a great job up there in third place. Shell V-Power Racing up in fourth. They've had a great strong second half of the season. And Walkinshaw Andretti United, I must say, I was surprised to see up there in fifth as well. But that will just about bring my round review to an end. Thank you for your patience on this. I've had a few tech issues getting this green screen set up, and in fact it's probably looking a little bit rough on camera, but we got there. We've got the face cam going. Hopefully it's added to the experience for you, and now we have to look forward to the next event, the Gold Coast 500 on the streets of Surfers Paradise. Completely different vibe to Bathurst, one of my favorite events as well, so I'm really excited for that. And of course the Velo Adelaide 500 to cap off the season. I'd love to know your thoughts on Bathurst. I appreciate all your thoughts so far as well, particularly around the soft tyre, and if you agree that may have been one of the large culprits for the somewhat tame race we saw at Bathurst, or any other factors you think may have contributed as well. But for me, as I said, sometimes a race just doesn't spark. It's unfortunate that happened at our biggest race of the year, but nevertheless, I'm excited for the back half of the championship. Until then, remember to treat people like a trackside down there in the comments. The P word is a dangerous one. Let's try and keep it civil. And thank you so much for the support on all the content, and I hope to see you back in another video very, very soon.